Hello, good evening, everyone. Today's lecture will be on Greta Thunberg, in particular the rhetorical style of Greta Thunberg. Now, keep in mind that your next assignment will be rhetorical analysis on a text that makes an argument about climate change. And for that assignment, you certainly could choose a speech by Greta Thunberg. So any of the texts I discuss in this lecture are fair game for a rhetorical analysis. And even if you don't focus primarily on Greta in your paper, you certainly can reference Greta's work in your introduction, in your conclusion, or as a point of comparison in your rhetorical analysis. And this is Georgie, who's joining me today for the opening lecture. Oh, he wants to take off, so let him go. Hello. Now today I'll focus primarily on ethos. I'll begin with some thoughts on situated ethos, and then I'll move on to invented ethos. Now, if you remember, last Monday's lecture was focused on ethos, where I discussed some ways to think about situated ethos and invented ethos. Situated ethos being what an audience knows or assumes about you and your character based on either things you've done before, your resume or your reputation, or based on your identity, perhaps your age, your race, sexuality, gender, nationality, etc. And invented ethos is when you build your character, build who you are in your actual speech or your writing. So the things you do in real time to either reinforce what people know about you or to reinvent yourself, to potentially show a different side or a different aspect of who you are or your identity. Now, some introductory context on Greta Thunberg. She was born in 2003 in Sweden, and she is a very famous environmental activist, perhaps the most famous activist today. She has had phenomenal success in raising awareness about climate change and is most known for her work in building student-led movements to put pressure on economic and political leaders across the world. Greta first received national and international attention when she started her school strike for climate change in 2018. This climate strike began on the first day of school that year. Rather than attending class at her school, Greta instead went to the Swedish Parliament building in Stockholm to protest her government's inaction in addressing the climate crisis. For the entire school day, she displayed a handmade sign, School Strike for Climate, and handed out 100 flyers with facts and references about the climate crisis. Here is an image of Greta during her climate strike in 2018 with her famous sign. She said, reflecting on the experience, "I painted a sign on a piece of wood, and for the flyers wrote down some facts I thought everyone should know. And then I took my bike to the Parliament and just sat there. The first day I sat alone from about 8:30 to 3 p.m., the regular school day. And then on the second day, people started joining me. After that, there were people there all the time." You can see here how in just a couple days, a strike that began with one girl turned into a movement. After 3 weeks of her climate strike, Greta announced that she would continue this strike on each Friday until Sweden reduced its carbon emissions to meet the criteria of the Paris Agreement. So she shifted from an everyday strike to an every Friday strike, allowing her to continue to attend school. This began the Fridays for Future Strike for Climate, an international movement led by students around the globe to protest inaction on climate change. Now I'm going to play a clip of a speech that Greta gave when she transitioned from that first phase of her protest to the second phase, from the everyday strike to the strike on Fridays. And in this clip, I want you to think of a couple things. One, the way that she delivers her speech, Greta was not well practiced in public speaking. She had not spoken in public hardly at all for many years. She experienced selective mutism, where she only spoke to her parents and her sister. However, despite this lack of experience, you'll see that she has some strong qualities as a public speaker, and they were there from day one. And two, you'll see how she always assembled her collective ethos with other students. So in this speech, she recognizes the solidarity she has with these additional students that had joined her protest over the last 3 weeks.
My name is Greta Thunberg and I am 15 years old, and this is Mina, Morgan and Edith. And we have school strike for the climate for the last 3 weeks. Yesterday was the last day, but we will go on with the school strike. Every Friday, as from now, we will sit outside the Swedish Parliament until Sweden is in line with the Paris Agreement. We urge all of you to do the same. Sit outside your parliament or local government, wherever you are, until your country is on a safe pathway to a below 2-degree warming target. Time is much shorter than we think. Failure means disaster. The changes required are enormous, and we must all contribute in every part of our daily life, especially us in the rich countries where no nation is doing nearly enough. The grown-ups has failed us, and since most of them, including the press and the politicians, keep ignoring the situation, we must take action into our own hands.
When watching this clip, it's also striking that this is the very beginning of a global movement, in the sense that there aren't any big production crews here, television crews. It is a local speech to her local community. And over the next couple years, she certainly will have more practice speaking to larger and larger audiences. But here we get a glimpse from the very beginning. And even at the very first stage, even in 3 weeks into her protest, we still see some of the hallmarks of her rhetorical style and her overall agenda. An interesting aspect of Greta's rhetorical style is how age shapes her argument. Greta was 15 when she began her climate strike. Being 15 meant she was unable to vote. Greta represented a population of teenagers that had no formal way of asserting political power. Her climate strike became an informal way that Greta could express political agency, a form of protest that was inherently rhetorical. Also, at age 15, Greta was a voice for a younger generation, a generation which would suffer the most from political and economic inaction in response to the climate crisis. So how does Greta use her age in many of her appeals? One way is certainly highlighting this inherent unfairness of being part of a generation that can't vote, that has no power, but ultimately will suffer the most from the effects of climate change. Another thing she does, another move she makes, is how she projects her life into the future. Greta is able to position herself as someone who will see the next 70, 80, even 90 years of climate change. So the full effects of the climate crisis will shape her life to the end of the century. Greta also uses her age and being part of this younger generation as a way to shame the older generations. She consistently holds these older audience members accountable for their actions. And she believes that shame and guilt can play a role in changing people's actions and behaviors. Now, looking to the right of your screen, we can see a lot of these appeals in action. This is a letter by Greta when she was 15. My name is Greta and I am 15 years old. My little sister, Beta, will turn 13 this autumn. We cannot vote in the parliamentary election, even though the political issues now at stake are going to affect our whole lives. If we live to be 100, then we're going to be here well into the next century. And that sounds really strange, I know. Because when you talk about the future today, it usually means in just a few years' time. Everything beyond the year 2050 is so distant that it doesn't even exist in our imaginations. But by then, my sister and I, hopefully, will not even have lived half our lives. In the years 2078 and 2080, we will celebrate our 75th birthdays. If we have children and grandchildren, perhaps they'll celebrate those birthdays with us. Perhaps we'll tell them what it was like when we were children. Perhaps we'll tell them about all of you. So again, in that excerpt, we can see her reflecting on that fundamental unfairness of being part of this generation. We can see her projecting her life into the future, and we can also see her holding the older generations accountable, and even in the last line, threatening them that they will not be remembered fondly. Another interesting aspect of Greta Thunberg's ethos is her autism. Greta's rhetorical style, in many ways, uses autism as an asset. Greta Thunberg's success as an activist has also stressed the importance of neurodiversity, a concept that encourages the recognition and celebration of neurological differences in academic, professional, and social settings. In these two passages, Milena Ehrman, Greta's mother, explains the importance of her daughter's diagnosis. Our daughter has Asperger's, high-functioning autism, and OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. Autism and ADHD and all the other neuropsychiatric functional impairments are not handicaps per se. In many cases, they can be a superpower. That out-of-the-box thinking you so often hear performers, artists, and celebrities talk about. Performers like me, for instance. And in this passage, we really do get the sense of how Greta and her family frame her autism as an advantage. It allows her to see the problem and explain the problem in ways that other activists are unable to. In these passages, Milena Ehrman elaborates more on the importance of neurodiversity and how autism helped Greta look at this issue in a different way. She writes, "One day in school, Greta's class watched a film about how much rubbish there is in the oceans. An island of plastic larger than Mexico is floating around in the South Pacific. Greta cries throughout the film. Her classmates are also clearly moved. Before the lesson is over, the teacher announces that on Monday there will be a substitute teaching the class because she is going to a wedding over the weekend in Connecticut, right outside of New York. Wow, lucky you, the people say. Out in the corridor, the trash island of the coast off Chile is already forgotten. New iPhones are taken out. Everyone who has been in New York talks about how great it is with all those shops. And Barcelona has amazing shopping too. And in Thailand, everything is so cheap. And someone is going with their mother to Vietnam. And Greta can't reconcile any of this. It doesn't add up. And there is an unbearable feeling of loneliness and hopelessness that just won't go away. Had she not been different, she would have been able to handle that feeling, just like the rest of us. She could have left it in that classroom, but she couldn't. She never could." And here's Greta elaborating on this moment in her life and on how autism helped her, again, see this issue from a different perspective. "I overthink. Some people can just let things go, but I can't, especially if there's something that worries me. I remember when I was younger and in school, our teachers showed us films of plastic in the ocean. I cried through all the movies. My classmates were concerned when they watched the film, but when it stopped, they started thinking about other things. I couldn't do that. Those pictures were stuck in my head. I kept thinking about it and just wondered if I'm going to have a future. And I kept that to myself because I'm not very much of a talker, and that wasn't healthy. I became very depressed and stopped going to school. When I was home, my parents took care of me, and we started talking because we had nothing else to do. And then I told them about my worries and concerns about the climate crisis and the environment, and it felt good to just get that off my chest. And a very important part about this passage comes at the end when she talks about how talking about her anxiety and concerns about the climate actually helped her improve in terms of her mental health and her physical health. Now, in this final section, I want to discuss a bit more broadly Greta Thunberg's speaking style. Some of the hallmarks of this style are her bluntness and clarity. Her tone is often also considered very pessimistic, certainly in comparison to the ways that other media outlets try to focus on optimistic projections or the possibilities for change. Her invented ethos, the way she shapes her character in her speeches and writing, prioritizes honesty and stresses the urgency of the crisis. Her rhetorical appeals are built on a strong sense of ethics. She often shames economic leaders, and she clearly assigns responsibility to specific targets: people, states, generations, and organizations. Now, to finish up today's lecture, I'm going to play excerpts from two of her well-known speeches and then a short remix of her speech at the UN from last fall. The first speech, titled "Our House is on Fire," was delivered at the World Economic Forum in Davos on January 25th, 2019.
I am here to say our house is on fire. According to the IPCC, we are less than 12 years away from not being able to undo our mistakes. In that time, unprecedented changes in all aspects of society needs to have taken place, including a reduction of our CO2 emissions by at least 50%. And please note that those numbers do not include the aspect of equity, which is absolutely necessary to make the Paris Agreement work on a global scale. Nor does it include tipping points or feedback loops like the extreme powerful methane gas being released from the thawing Arctic permafrost. At places like Davos, people like to tell success stories, but their financial success has come with an unthinkable price tag. And on climate change, we have to acknowledge that we have failed. All political movements in their present form have done so. And the media has failed to create broad public awareness. But Homo sapiens have not yet failed. Yes, we are failing, but there is still time to turn everything around. We can still fix this.
It's important to note that it's only been 5 months since she started her climate strike. So it's still fairly early in her public life as an activist. In this speech, we see her characteristic bluntness, her honesty, her sense of urgency, her clarity, both with the way she addresses facts and the way that she looks towards the future. And she, again, holds the older generation responsible. She holds people in power responsible very directly and very bluntly. And delivered at the World Economic Forum, her audience is filled with some of the richest and most powerful people on Earth. The second speech, "The World is Waking Up," was delivered at the UN General Assembly in New York City on September 23rd, 2019.
Is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
In this excerpt from one of her most famous speeches given in New York this last fall, we see Greta growing in confidence, but alongside that confidence, we see an even stronger articulation of her anger directed at the world's leaders, in this case, the leaders at the UN. In many ways, it is a remarkable narrative. In just a year, she went from giving a public speech in her local community after 3 weeks of her climate strike to delivering a speech streamed by millions at the UN in front of the world's leaders. Now, the final clip I will show is actually a remix of the previous speech that we just saw an excerpt from. This remix both shows how a artist in the United States responded to the speech in a powerful way, again showing that her speech had reached and connected with a large audience. And it also, I think, highlights some of the emotional and ethical contours of her speech. The remix distills some of the key components of her rhetorical style. And it's also a bit fun from my perspective.
What's your message to world leaders today?
My message is that we'll be watching you.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet, talking to us young people further. How dare you?
Wrapping up today's lecture, I encourage you all to explore Greta Thunberg's various speeches and to learn more about her. I also think she's a very valuable figure to study in our current context. She is someone who truly is trying to reach a global audience, and she's trying to encourage cooperation between different cultures, different nationalities, different peoples. She's someone who truly believes in the power of persuasion and the power of rhetoric to be able to build a movement and ultimately solve a crisis that is global in scope.